Hello, dear friends. Welcome to our last Plantagenet King in our journey through the chronicles of the age of chivalry. This has been a wonderful book. If you've not got the previous parts, we've had multiple parts on King Edward the Third, King Edward the Second. It's been absolutely fascinating because within the historical accounts that we see here, we also get chronicles made by people living at the time that have recorded down their first-hand accounts for us to experience together. So without much further ado, let's take a look at the life and times of Edward III, who served for actually quite a considerably long time, given the period. So the long reign of Edward III began unpropitiously with the deposition of his father, as we learned in the last part, the very hated King Edward II. Once he'd attained his majority and had broken away from the tutelage of his mother, Isabella of France, the king was to earn great glory. He indulged his taste for warfare to the full, a taste shared with his equally bellicose son, Edward, the Black Prince, in the long conflict with the House of Valois over the throne of France. This, the 100 Years' War, broke out in 1337 and was not resolved until the end of the 15th century, and its early stages saw some major English victories, notably at Crecy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, and the emergence of a glittering cult of chivalry. But to the miseries of war were added from 1348 the horrific effects of the Black Death. The lively chronicle of Geoffrey le Baker provides the main narrative, followed by the celebrated works of Froissart and Hainault, and those of his compatriot Jean Lebel. Thomas Walsingham, a monk of St. Albans, describes the last year of Edward III's reign. So let's hear from Geoffrey le Baker. So after glorious King Edward II had given up his crown to his eldest son, Edward of Windsor, the noblemen and clergy of England at once received Edward, a lad of about 15 years, pleasing to God and to the whole world, as his father's successor in Parliament in London. And so on the 1st of February, Prince Edward was crowned at Westminster by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Walter Reynolds. This great ceremony was attended by many foreigners as well as English, and in particular the mercenaries of the Queen Mother Isabella, whom she herself invited from Hainault and Germany. The new king received the crown which the most blessed confessor, St. Edward, his predecessor, had worn. It was of vast size and a great weight. He bore it like a man, so that those who saw marvelled that such a slip of a lad, who had never worn a crown before, could manage to wear one of such size and weight. In 1328, King Charles IV of France, the King of England's uncle, and the brother of Isabella the Queen Mother, went the way of all flesh. He was succeeded by Philip de Valois. Went the way of all flesh, that's quite a poetic way of signalling the end of a life. So the start of the 100 Years' War, most of the battles took place on French soil, but the northern Spanish kingdoms of Aragon and also of Castile had been caught up in it as well. In 1366, the Black Prince, who was ruling as Prince of Aquitaine, took advantage of a lull in the conflict and agreed to go to the aid of the King Peter the Cruel of Castile. Peter had been disposed by his half-brother Henry of Trastamara, backed by Bertrand de Guesclin, whose allegiance was to the French crown. Control of Castile and its navy was at stake, and the Black Prince showed his military prowess to the full in his victory near Nájera in 1367. His levy of crushing taxes in Gascony to pay for his Spanish campaign stirred up considerable opposition, and a resumption of hostilities with the French king followed in 1368. Here's a bit more of that chronicle. That year, a fortnight after Easter, when Parliament had been held by King Edward III, a shameful peace was made between the English and the Scots. I don't think this chronicler likes Bruce, who had been adopted as King of the Scots, should marry Joanna, sister of Edward III, and with her should reign peacefully over Scotland in his own right, and indeed this later came to pass. In that same year, the young King of England, not yet well ruled, but under the evil influence of traitors, drew up a charter for Scotland, whose significance and terms were not generally known. Furthermore, the charter by which the people of Scotland and their King John Balliol had made submission in perpetuity to the King of England, on behalf of themselves and those to come after them, in testimony of which the seal of the King of England, with the seals of the magnates and prelates of that realm, had been appended to it, was brought forth on the end of a long spear at Berwick upon Tweed, in the presence of the councils of both kingdoms, read out, revoked absolutely, and burned in the presence of all. There, David Bruce was betrothed to the King of England's sister and crowned. On being dedicated at the altar, the child, who was suffering from diarrhea, dirtied himself. At this, the Scotsman James Douglas said to his friends, "I am afraid he will besmirch the whole kingdom of Scotland." It was with reference to this event that blasphemers called him David Drip on the altar. Oh dear, poor baby. It's not his fault. Babies have accidents all the time now. So, an education at arms. This is a carving of Queen Isabella at Bristol Cathedral here. It's quite a lovely carving, actually. Edward III was only 14 years old when he was crowned, on the 1st of February 1327, and for 3 years he was only really king in name, because he remained firmly under the tutelage of his mother Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, who had usurped royal authority. The new regime was quick to make peace with France, conceding the Agenais, paying them a massive sum of £60,000 as an inheritance due, and agreeing that the young Edward should do homage to the French king for all his continental lands. Worse humiliation followed at the hands of the Scots. The campaign led by the young king against Robert Bruce was a total disaster, and in 1328 Bruce was able to dictate his terms in the Treaty of Northampton, described as the shameful peace. The English abandoned all they'd fought for since the days of Edward I and renounced his claims to the overlordship of Scotland. These failures, and the Earl of March's overweening arrogance and greed, hastened the break-up of the Barons' coalition. So opposition to Mortimer was led by Henry of Lancaster, who won the support of the king's uncles, the Earls of Norfolk and Kent, and in 1329 civil war was only narrowly averted by the mediation of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So with peace restored, Mortimer moved quickly to crush his enemies. The weak and foolish Edmund, Earl of Kent, was the most vulnerable. He was tricked into believing that his brother Edward II was still alive, and became involved in plots to secure his release. These were immediately reported to Mortimer, who accused the Earl of treason, and secured a conviction on his own confession. Edward III was no longer a boy, however, but a man of nearly 18, a husband and the father of a son, the future Black Prince. Since becoming king, he had experienced nothing but humiliation at the hands of Isabella and Mortimer. The judicial murder of Kent gave added urgency to the plans of Edward and his well-wishers to seize power from the overmighty Earl of March. The trap was sprung in October 1330. Isabella and Mortimer were arrested by Edward and his men in Nottingham Castle. Isabella was firmly retired from public life at Castle Rising, while Mortimer was arrested and condemned to death. He was drawn through London to the Elms at Tyburn and hanged. Freed from the tutelage, the young king was now free to indulge his taste for military glory to the full in major campaigns against the Scots and the French. Now, for any of you thinking what parts of history may have informed such fantastical violence, treachery and scandalous productions such as Game of Thrones, then this particular time period, it's all about it. Mothers, lovers, brothers, sons, all conspiring against each other. This is Edward's head and blazon, and this is the King Arthur's Round Table. Here's a bit more chronicle. Edmund, Earl of Kent, the late king's brother, sent a Dominican friar to Corfe to discover whether the story was true about Edward II being alive, I assume. This friar, who had hoped to bribe the doorkeeper of the castle, was himself deceived, for he was taken into the doorkeeper's chamber to lie concealed during the day, so that he might have the opportunity to see the man he sought when night came. friar was led into the great hall and instructed to put on the clothes of a layman so he could not be noticed. There he had the impression that he saw Edward II, the king's father, sitting down to a splendid feast. This he believed, and this is what he told the Earl of Kent on his return. The Earl then swore an oath in the presence of certain people whom he should not have trusted, that he would make it his aim that his brother Edward II should be set free from the place where he was held prisoner. In that same year, the third of his reign, at the request of those who hated his father, King Edward III held Parliament at Winchester. There, at the instigation of the king's mother, Isabella, and Roger Mortimer, accusations were made against the king's uncle, the Earl of Kent, and against many other nobles and members of the clergy, including the provincials of the Dominican and Carmelite orders. They were alleged to have conspired to free the king's father from prison, make him king again, although the plan was a fantastical impossibility. The Earl of Kent was beheaded as a consequence of his own admissions and the letters which were found about his person, but no confessional letter, however true, could be enough to justify such a punishment for a man of that rank. The provincials of the Dominicans and the Carmelites were sent into exile, but the Bishop of London was sent away with a pardon. The people of England regretted the death of the Earl of Kent little, for the ways of his household servants were wicked. They travelled through the country, seizing the possessions of the common folk at the king's price, and giving in return little or no money. So a man's hero, Edward III was one of the dominant personalities of his age, a man whom round legends gathered. He's over 6 feet tall, he towered over his contemporaries literally as well as figuratively. For half a century his court was the most magnificent, his armies the most feared in Western Europe. Yet in spite of his great reputation, or perhaps because of it, historians have found it difficult to assess his true character. He was a man of action and passion, a lover of display and pageantry. The swashbuckling coup by which he seized power in 1330 set the tone for his reign, and his great feats of arms on the field of France. He was never happier than when leading his troops on campaign or jousting and feasting with his knightly companions in arms. In short, he was a new King Arthur, just as his subjects expected him to be. It was his good fortune, therefore, to be ideally suited by physique, temperament, and taste for the role to which he had been born, unlike his unfortunate father, Edward II. He was also lucky in his marriage to Queen Philippa, daughter of the Count of Hainault, who bore him 12 children. That is nuts. Like, seeing what my wife went through to give birth to 2 children, I just can't imagine, the strength and strive to go through that physical experience. It's amazing. Her calm, good-natured gentleness and dignified tolerance of her husband's infidelities won her universal affection. After her death in 1369, Edward deteriorated rapidly into premature old age. I do find that's quite sweet in a morbid way when one person starts to decline with the loss of their love, just these 2 souls bound together. Edward wasn't just a pleasure-loving warrior, he was a shrewd politician, keenly aware of the damage that the monarchy had suffered during his father's reign. He determined to re-establish its authority and prestige. He knew that political stability instinctively depended on maintaining good relations with the nobility. Successful military campaigns, tournaments, the chivalric orders of the Round Table, and the Garter all strengthened the bonds between the king and his barons, which established a common sense of purpose and companionship. His love of display and ostentation, too, was more than mere extravagance. Fine clothes, magnificent feasts, great building projects like Windsor Castle boosted the image of monarchy, emphasizing its splendour and wealth, and as a result its authority and stability. There may have been a darker side to Edward III's passions. He was notoriously licentious, and rumours circulated about his affair with the Countess of Salisbury, probably Alice, wife of Edward Montague, the younger brother of the Earl of Salisbury. The chronicler Jean Lebel relates how the king brutally... well, you can probably see that word there. I'm not going to say it for the purposes of being PG for YouTube, but left her battered, bleeding and dishonoured. That is horrible. Truly horrible. If that actually happened, then I suppose I don't care what chivalric deeds this man did or how lovely he was. That's not just a dark side, that's evil. Here's a bit of a chronicle from 1334. So on June the 19th, Edward Balliol, King of the Scots, came to Newcastle upon Tyne and rendered homage to Edward III, King of England, for the Kingdom of Scotland, to be held of him as overlord. Because the King of England had, at great expense, helped him to return to and take possession of Scotland, the King of Scots granted the Scottish shires closest to the English March, Berwick, Roxburgh, Peebles and Dumfries, with the town of Haddington and the town and castle of Jedburgh, and the forests of Selkirk, Ettrick and Jedburgh to be separated from the crown of Scotland, annexed to the crown of England in perpetuity. David Bruce, when the Scots anointed their king on 30th of November 1331, had been sheltering in the strong fortress of Dumbarton. In the spring of 1334, he had sailed to France, where he performed homage to King Philip VI, so that he would hold Scotland from him as overlord, in return for which the King of France would help him to recover its kingdom from the hands of the King of England, Edward III, and the other King of Scots, Edward Balliol. So the Battle of Scotland, David II was 5 years old when he succeeded his father as King of Scotland in 1329. The coronation was at Scone, and for the first time a pope gave permission for a Scottish king to be formally crowned and anointed. In 1332, however, Edward Balliol had pretended to the Scottish throne, defeated David's supporters near Perth, and was himself crowned at Scone as Edward I of Scotland. David's supporters fought back, expelling him from the realm, but Balliol returned in 1333 with the full backing of the English king. Their forces overcame David's army at Halidon Hill near Berwick upon Tweed. Shortly afterward, David was evacuated to France, a country with which Scots had long had diplomatic relationships and trading ties, and remained there for 8 years while the war in Scotland dragged on. He returned home in 1341. In 1346, the French called on him to fulfil his obligations under the Treaty of Corbeil, in exchange for nebulous promises of support. The Scots had undertaken to invade England whenever the French king required, and as Edward III laid siege to Calais, the French called for such a campaign. A Scots force therefore crossed the border and headed for Durham, but it was intercepted at Neville's Cross and was soundly defeated. David himself was wounded in the head with an arrow and taken prisoner. Edward stood to win a king's ransom, but the Scots were unwilling to pay to have their king back, and Edward sent David to Scotland on parole to negotiate his own ransom. That's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? They're not giving me money, you go yourself and tell them to give me money. Bizarre. There are rumours that David was obtaining his freedom by selling Scotland's independence. It's more likely that the terms he offered to a council at Scone were the maximum he'd been prepared to concede. A hefty ransom and the succession of one of Edward III's sons to the Scottish throne should David die childless. The terms were rejected. David returned to London. In February 1356, Edward III embarked upon a campaign of destruction in southern Scotland. Later that year, the Black Prince captured the French king at Poitiers, and the Scots, isolated, accepted his terms, a 10-year truce and a ransom of £66,000 payable in instalments. In October 1357, David returned to Scotland at liberty. It remained for the Scots to reorganise the collection of the ransom, a heavy and long-lasting burden on a war-weary land. David II's rule was strong and effective. He was vigorous in administering justice and imposing his will upon the Scots barons, many of whom remained reluctant to pay his ransom. Only 2 annual instalments were made over to the English king as agreed, and in 1377, when Edward III died, over a quarter of the total still remained unpaid. It's a lot of money. Again, £66,000 in the 1300s, a huge amount of money. The first EEC is the High Gothic Cathedral of Cologne. Amazing. The Archbishop was one of the main supporters of the Holy Roman Empire. Beautiful building, isn't it? So in April 1337, Edward III dispatched an embassy to the Low Countries to win allies among the Counts of Flanders and Hainault and other princes of northern Europe for the impending war against France. This was a strategy was utterly ruinous. It drew the English king into the complexities of imperial politics, humiliated him before his enemies, and in 4 years left him financially and politically bankrupt. It took all of Edward's later military successes to redeem him from this, the worst mistake of his career. In the 14th century, the Holy Roman Empire extended from Brussels to Rome. It included most of the Netherlands, all of Germany between the Rhine and the Polish frontier, as well as Switzerland, Austria and northern Italy. The emperor's authority was limited, but the prestige attached to his office was enormous. Because the title was elective rather than hereditary, it was open to fierce and often unscrupulous competition. The Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria spent most of his reign trying to overcome the problems caused by a disputed election. In the process, he killed his rival, alienated his fellow rulers in Germany, and was condemned as a heretic by 3 successive popes. Such were the political and religious controversies raging in empire at the outset of the 100 Years' War. Edward III had no particular desire to be involved in these matters, but his relations with Philip VI of France deteriorated in the 30s, and he became acutely aware of the need to build up a confederation of friendly states on the continent. He looked for support to his nearest neighbours across the North Sea. England had important historic and commercial links with the Netherlands, recently reinforced by the marriages of Edward to Philippa of Hainault and of the English Princess Eleanor to the Count of Guelders. Edward hoped to exploit these ties in diplomatic missions in 1337. The king's emissary stayed at Valenciennes in Hainault, a convenient point from which to communicate with the princes of the empire, and with the county of Flanders, which, as it was hoped, might renounce its allegiance to France and join the Plantagenet cause. The Emperor Louis was won over with a promise of £60,000, but the coalition soon became a liability. By the spring of 1338, Edward had run up obligations of some 276,000 to the German princes. It soon became clear that the English exchequer did not have the resources to meet these debts. When Edward eventually organised an attack into northern France from Brabant, the prince's military assistance counted for little. The English army was driven back. Edward's only answer was to offer still higher bribes, and there was no more money. He was forced to pawn his crown and handed over English noblemen as hostages for his debts. He returned to England late in 1340, his plans for a great military adventure in ruins. Neither side could afford to keep this alliance, and although England retained contact with the Netherlands, the German Confederation ceased to be significant in Edward's strategy against France. Later in 1348, a group of princes hostile to Louis's successor Charles IV offered to elect the English king as emperor, but the suggestion was politely declined. Edward's involvement in Germany between 1337 and 41 had been a fiasco. Not even the prospect of the imperial title could tempt him to repeat that error. While rejecting Holy Roman Emperor must mean that he had a seriously bad time of it. Here in a chronicle of 1339, in the 12th year of his reign, Edward III began his campaign against the tyrant of France, Philip VI, on the 20th of September. At the head of a force of 12,000 armed men, his standard flying, he rode forth into Cambresis, burning and laying waste to towns and castles in the area. One evening, at dusk, just as the shadows were gathering, Geoffrey Le Scrope, one of the King of England's justices, led a French cardinal, Bertrand de Montfaucon, up into a great and lofty tower, there indicating all the land in the direction of France to a distance of 15 miles which had been put to the torch. Geoffrey Le Scrope said to the cardinal, "My lord, does it seem to you that the silken cord which runs round the edge of France is broken?" When he heard this, the cardinal, as if in a faint, fell and lay stretched out on the roof of the tower, overcome with grief and fear. For 5 weeks the King of England rode through the kingdom of France, using the same tactics, and every day his army laid waste as much of the countryside as it was able. All the lands of Cambrai, Tournai, and the Vermontals and Leon, apart from the walled towns, churches and castles, were completely devastated. I just think of the poor civilians who had to live off the land, and these ambitions of wealthy people just utterly devastating the world that you live in. This is the King of England doing homage for Aquitaine and Ponthieu. I mean, that's doing homage, is it? It looks like a rather passionate embrace, some sort of ballroom dance. Here are some heavily armoured English troops embarking for France at the outset of the 100 Years' War. I just love how illustrative the art style of this time was. Just like kind of cartoons that represent the reality. this chronicle. When they saw the English army approaching, the inhabitants fled in terror. Indeed, no one dared to resist this advance, although the King of France had assembled his own great armies outside his walled cities, while he himself hid in the well-fortified town of San Quentin. Not once did he dare to venture outside the walls of his cities to defend the lands that he claimed were his against the King of England, while the latter always led his army in the field. Moreover, among the many slanders which everyone repeated about the French tyrant, someone attached the following to an arrow and shot it into the town of San Quentin. If you're so strong, Valois, then what do you fear? Don't hide away, show us your strength, come near. You may be a flower, but you're wilt if you stay in the dry. With those coward spots, you're more leopard than lion, say I. And playing on the king's name because he was called Philip de Valois, another made up the following verse. Vi is a blemish, Lippus is a stain, Philippus is twice as bad again. However, when he heard that Edward's allies, the men of the county of Brabant, that because food was in short supply and a harsh winter was approaching, he decided to retreat, and were indeed retreating. The tyrant of France, Philip VI, decided to face the army of the King of England, who, awaiting him, joyfully recalled the men of Brabant. Having received letters from the tyrant to the effect that he was willing to join battle, Edward III sent a message in return to say that he was willing to wait for Philip 3 days in the field. And so on the 4th day the King of England waited in the appointed field for the King of France. The latter, however, would not come any closer than 2 miles distant. He then beat a shameful retreat to Paris, having broken the bridges and blocked the roads with cut down trees and branches behind him, so that the King of England would be unable to follow in pursuit. So we were referring to the 100 Years' War, which was only the final phase of a much longer struggle, which began when William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, became King of England in 1066. As we know, the King of England held extensive lands in France, and the power of the French kings grew. As it grew, they became more determined to drive the English king into the sea. So the only substantial English possession left in France by 1250 was the Duchy of Aquitaine, or Gascony, that was already exporting fine claret wine into England, lovely Bordeaux, red. Edward I was only narrowly defeated in an attempt by Philip the Fair to confiscate and conquer Gascony in 1290s. It soon became clear to Edward that in the 1330s that his cousin and adversary Philip VI was looking for any excuse to repeat the attempt. The 100 Years' War, therefore, can be seen as the civil war in France, a battle between the French king and his greatest vassal. By the 14th century, though, the struggle was increasingly taking on international dimensions. The Scots, fighting desperately for their independence against Edward III, found firm allies in France. In 1334, Philip VI insisted that there could be no settlement with England over Gascony unless the King of Scots' rights were guaranteed in the same treaty. For his part, Edward III sought to cultivate support in the Low Countries. The final breach was caused by fear in England of a French invasion. In 1336, Philip VI planned an expedition across the narrow seas to assist the Scots, and sailed a huge fleet, ostensibly gathered through a crusade, to the Channel ports. Edward III prepared to meet the threat, securing a large war tax from a worried Parliament, and in the following year the French made a preemptive strike by invading Gascony. The 100 Years' War had begun. Edward possessed a powerful weapon denied to his predecessors in the struggle with France, a claim to the French crown, the Capetian royal house, that had passed the French throne from father to son in unbroken line from 987, suddenly came to an end in 1328. The 3 sons of Philip the Fair had occupied the throne in succession, and all died childless. The crown passed to Philip VI of Valois, cousin of the last 3 Capetians and of Edward III. Edward was Philip III's grandson through his mother Isabella of France, and although he was in no position in 1328 to advance his title to the French throne, and claims through the female line were debarred by the Parliament of Paris, in 1337, when Philip declared Gascony forfeit to the French crown, Edward was able to trump his adversary's ace by asserting his hereditary right, and in 1340 he formally laid claim to the Kingdom of France and added the fleur-de-lis to his coat. So in 1340, not long afterwards, in early February, Edward III returned to England, having sent the Queen, Philippa of Hainault, who was expecting a child, to Ghent. He He held Parliament at Westminster, where the laity made him a grant of every 9th fleece of wool, every 9th lamb, every 9th sheaf of grain, of every variety. The clergy granted him a 19th of the same produce. The King of England then resolved and proclaimed that no Englishman should be subject to him as King of France. King Edward III celebrated Pentecost at Ipswich, where he waited to sail back to Flanders. The king had intended to make his journey with only a few companions. However, when he heard a rumour that the French tyrant Philip VI had sent a great fleet of ships from Spain, and almost all of the French fleet to prevent him from sailing, Edward summoned his own fleet from the Cinque Ports and elsewhere. Thus, with 260 ships, great and small, he made a fortunate start to his journey to Flanders, with a following wind on Thursday the 22nd of June. On the Friday he saw the French fleet in the port of Blankenberg, all ready for battle and disposed like the ranks of an army camp. So anchoring his ships off Sluys at some distance from the shore, King Edward deliberated the best plan of action for a whole day. However, early on the morning of the 24th of June, the French fleet separated into 3 sections and moved about a mile towards where the English fleet lay. And when he saw this, the King of England announced that they should no longer wait, but arm themselves and be at the ready. In the early afternoon, with the sun and wind behind him and the current flowing so as to aid his attack, Edward III divided his fleet into 3 sections and delivered the longed-for attack upon the enemy. Here we have the French Duke in heraldic regalia and the quarterings of knights here. So for centuries the earldom was the sole hereditable rank in England. By the 1300s, however, earldoms were in decline. From 23 in 1154 they dwindled to a mere 10 in 1337. The Crown's attitude towards creating earldoms was always strongly influenced by the need to provide for the younger males of the royal family. When the time came for Henry III to provide for his younger brother, Richard, the king had little alternative but to create an English earldom for him. The new earldom, Cornwall, has remained in the royal family ever since. Henry's son and heir Edward, however, had no title. When he became King Edward I, he created only 3 earldoms. His younger brother, Edmund Crouchback, became Earl of Lancaster, and his 2 younger sons were created Earls of Norfolk and Kent. When he died in 1307, most of the earldoms were held by his relatives. A complete reversal of his father's policy, Edward II gave his favourite, Piers Gaveston, the royal earldom of Cornwall, when Richard's son died without heirs, and created the earldoms of Winchester and Carlisle for other favourites. All 3 were later executed and forfeited their titles. During the 14th century, the nobility of England began to recognise an elite among themselves. These were the peers of the blood royal, descendants of the kings to the male line. In France, such men were known as the princes of the fleur-de-lis. There's no doubt that Edward III was following the French example in 1337 when he raised the earldom of Cornwall, held by his son Edward, the Black Prince, to a dukedom, the first in England. Previously, the French title of Duke had been held only by the English kings as Dukes of Normandy and Aquitaine. The lands of the Duchy of Cornwall have provided an income for the king's son ever since. The title Prince of Wales, first given to Edward I's oldest son, is purely honorary, which of course exists in our monarchy to this very day. Prince of Wales was Charles, and now I believe is William. At the same time, he added his new tier to the English hierarchy. Edward III also expanded the next rank down by creating 7 new earldoms. Most of them went to young men, his own companions in arms. Victory at sea. Here's close action at the Battle of Sluys and a warship filled with soldiers. So when Edward III attacked Sluys and Flanders on July the 24th, 1340, his action resulted in the capture or destruction of practically the entire French fleet. His admirals, more accustomed to fighting on land, bunched their ships together in the mouth of the Swin, against the advice of the Genoese commander. In 3 squadrons, the ships of each chained like a line of castles. They were crammed with men, although few were experienced men-at-arms and crossbowmen. The English fleet bore down on them after 9 o'clock with the advantages of wind, tide and sun behind them, arrayed so that each shipful of men-at-arms alternated with one of archers. The leading French squadron fought for 3 hours while English bowmen shot hails of arrows. Seamen across the ships. Many men on both sides drowned in their heavy armour before the 2 French admirals surrendered. Both were executed, and the wounded were thrown overboard by the English, who suffered from French piracy and raiding. The English then attacked the 2nd and 3rd squadrons. The struggle continued after darkness fell by the light of burning French vessels. And during the night, 30 ships escaped, but this didn't detract from the magnitude of Edward's first great triumph in the 100 Years' War. The invasion threat was removed, and more than 200 vessels captured. So many French had drowned, it is said that if French could speak, they would have learned French. Both sides fought slows as a land battle, the normal naval tactic of the time. Most English ships were cogs, broad-beamed merchantmen of 30 to 200 tons, high-sided and capacious. Their wind resistance, primitive rudders, and square sails made them unmanoeuvrable and ill-suited to war. And while the French built proper war galleys on the Mediterranean model in the arsenal at Rouen, Edward's Royal Navy was embryonic, a handful of galleys and large cogs with castles, fighting platforms, fore and aft. On the open sea they were to prove no match for the warships. The ancient duty of these sink ports to provide ships at their own expense was in decline as the ports signed up. So the king's ships were augmented by the royal right to arrest all English shipping in times of need. As a result, most ships in English fleets were requisitioned merchantmen, temporarily converted for war. The sailors' wages were paid by the king. Ordinary seamen received 3d a day, masters twice as much. Many vessels were provided in this way, over 700 for the campaign of Crécy and Calais, mainly from London, Southampton and the east coast ports. The rudimentary system was cheap, but it had its disadvantages. There was no question of England controlling the sea after the Sluys. Cogs could hold station for short periods only in good weather, and before long French raids resumed. Local communities bore the burden of coastal defence, and while the war at sea went well for England, there was the chance of seizing profitable cargoes, but in the long run these gains were more than offset by commandeering ships for the navy. Wages paid by the government did not balance lost profits from trade. Requisition ships often lay idle in port waiting for the troops they were to carry, their owners receiving little compensation for lost income. During Edward III's reign, many individuals and communities complained that their ships were lost to the French and their livelihoods gone. I still can't get over this whole idea of at any point the monarchy, the king, can just take your stuff for the need of war, and it seems the need of war was frequent. I mean, it was forged the world that we live in today eventually, I suppose, but it's still a bizarre thing. And with that, I think we'll put a pin in it for the life of Edward III. I look forward